Dear audience, dear judges, I am William Chen William, and today I will introduce you to the tragedy of Chernobyl. Just as Mikhail Gorbachev once said, the nuclear meltdown at Chernobyl was perhaps the real cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union 5 years later. In other words, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the roots lied in Chernobyl. Now, Chernobyl nuclear power plants was actually very different from those of the Western style. It provides massive amount of civilian energy as well as support the military nuclear arsenal of the USSR. It helps the USSR conduct military arm race in a much cheaper way. It is the supplier of the nuclear power of the USSR. It is a civilian power grid. Its high power reactor is capable of generating 1,000 megawatts of electricity. It supplies hundreds of thousands of civilians' daily use of electricity and the daily use of energies within Ukraine and the entire Kyiv region. The plutonium production designed with individual fuel channels that could be accessed while the reactor was still running. This modular design allowed the USSR to build massive reactor without specialized, expensive, heavy foregoing equipment. In other words, it allows the USSR to conduct arm race, to conduct military race with the Western bloc in a much cheaper cost, in which is very useful for the USSR at that time when they're already facing economic stagflation. It is designed to run on low enriched uranium. However, their choices of using low enriched uranium and the choices of cutting down this cost actually eventually lead to the failure. It is mainly composed of three core elements. First is the nuclear fission. The RMBK use U dioxide, which is uranium dioxide fuels, pellet, to enrich with uranium-235 to create reactions. When a neutron strikes a U-235 nucleus, it will split, release thermal energy, and more fast neutrons. The RMBK 1000 uses graphite blocks to slow these neutrons down into thermal neutrons. In another word, it is the low enriched uranium. They use cheap materials to create reactions, and this reaction eventually lead to nuclear fission, which eventually helped them provide the nuclear energy needed. However, take note of the graphite blocks. It will eventually lead to very big problems. Let's go to the cooling cycle. In this case, water serves two functions. It both absorbs the heat generated by the graphite and fuel rods. However, the heated water will then turn into steam as it absorbs so much heat. It drove the turbine to generate powers, steam engine in basic terms. As it generates power, water also acts as the nutrients absorber. It has two functions, both as the absorber as well as the energy provider. Furthermore, let's talk about the control system. We have the control rod made of boron carbide to absorb neutron, and the AZ5 button, which was the emergency switch. Pressing it should stop the reaction instantly. To put in simple terms, the AZ5 is a stop sign. When everything goes wrong, the operator would use this AZ5 button in order for it to stop further consequences. However, there is a design flaw. In order to displace water in the channel, the tips of these rods were made of graphite, which I will talk about this problem later. The fatal flaw of RMBK lies in its positive void coefficients. It uses graphite as the moderator and water only as the coolant. The explosion logic goes like this. As the water turns into steam, it should create energies to fuel it. However, more steam leads to less neutron absorption, and it leads to higher power, and it leads to even more steam. In one word, it leads to a dead-end cycle, a very bad cycle. The control rod also have a flaw in it. The reactor is very unstable. Almost all control rods were removed. This rod has graphite tips, and these tips will accelerate the reaction, and it will cause an instant explosion. In one word, the control rod and the AZ5 button, which is supposed to stop things from going wrong. When a mistake has been made, it should stop things from going even more wrong, right? However, it will ruin the entire situation in an unthinkable way. And this problem has already been discovered in 1975, almost 10 years before the Chernobyl incidents. It shows information asymmetry. The Leningrad nuclear disaster in 1975 has shown that positive void coefficient could lead to a total loss of control at low power. When one problem arises, people try to fix it. But when we try to fix it, it'll lead to more problem and eventually lead to an explosion. As I've seen in this picture here, this is a picture of the explosion in the Leningrad nuclear disaster in 1975. However, warning about the nuclear energy, the RMBK's behavior in extreme condition were classified as top secret by the KBGs. In other words, the highest leader does not want this problem to be shown to this world. It also does not want other nuclear reactor operators to know about this thing. Because of the state's encrypted the truth about graphite tips effect, the operator has no idea that at low power, AZ5 will act as a detonator. In this case, the operator does not know what they see as a safe button is actually an explosion button. So how did this actually happen? The entire incident happened from April 25 to April 26, 1986, the countdown to catastrophe. In 2 p.m. in 25th, the reactor was capped at half power for about 9 hours to meet Kiev's energy demand. However, this caused a massive buildup of Nexon 135. We can consider it as nuclear poison in this case. In other words, the system has already been overused and it needs time to rest. In 12 a.m., 26, which is midnight, the reactor power accidentally plummeted to near zero. This is caused by man-made mistakes. However, in this case, they should shut down the engine and let it rest and reuse it later. However, the deputy chief engineer, Deltov, threatened the staff and forced them to restart the experiment at any cost. He did this in order to meet his personal KPIs. He needed this for himself. However, it will lead to even more consequences at 1 a.m. The operator manually pulled out nearly all control rod. This violated the minimum safety requirements of the RBMK. And by 1:31 a.m. and 23, the turbine test started, and it triggered the positive void coefficients. In this case, there's already been a number that has been wrong, and they already know that there's a problem. And the operator pressed the AZ5 emergency stop button. However, this caused a power strike that blew the core apart, which is the explosion that everybody know about at 1:33. Now, what happened after the explosion? A picture here shows Vasily Ignatenko. He was one of the most famous Soviet firefighters that were known. It is also popularized by a very famous HBO TV series in America about Chernobyl. The firefighters were never told that the core has exploded. They were told that an ordinary electricity fire. Firefighters pick up graphite with their bare hands to clear the way when they first arrive. They see massive fires and the graphite on fire. They're holding the most radioactive material on the world, and they died in tragedy, most of them. While the fallout was spreading, the Soviets still forced thousands of people, including children, to parade in Kiev just days later to show the world that it is still stable. However, it took 18 days after the entire incident for Mikhail Gorbachev to finally address the nation on TV, which is called the first speech. However, instead of focusing on victims, much of the speech was spent blaming the West for anti-Soviet lies and trying to downplay the severity of the disaster. Just when the glasnost started, Chernobyl happened. And the Soviet people, as well as the world, has known that the USSR has once again broken its promises. When Chernobyl happened, the policy failed its first major test. The 18 days of silence proved that the state's instinct for keeping secrets was still stronger than its commitment for truth. In other words, people know that the USSR will never reach a level of openness that the world wanted. And this leads to the forced truth. The information leak. The USSR know that they can no longer hide the truth behind the Iron Curtain because the wind has blown the nuclear problems to the entire world, to the Western and Northern Europe. It has also led to scientific awakening. The disaster forced Soviet scientists to finally speak out about RMBK's encrypted flaws, and it led to a catalyst for collapse. People realized that the government has lied while children march in radioactive dust in the May Day parade, and it destroyed people's trust towards the system forever. It also led to the death of the Soviet myth. After the disaster, glasnost became a radical grassroots movement. It was first addressed by Gorbachev as a political policy intended to encourage people and make people believe in the system again. However, people stopped asking the state for permission to know the truth. They began demanding it as a right. There's been strikes, there's been uprising around the entire Eastern blocs. It changes from upper to down. It also ended the scientific socialism. Below is a picture of Chernobyl, Ukraine, in modern age, about 40 years after its collapse. The USSR used to claim that through centralized planning and superior Soviet engineering, and through dictatorship, the country could perfectly master nature as well as technology. Chernobyl has proven that the perfect Soviet system is actually prone to catastrophic human error and technical negligence. It is proof that the very system that created these technology eventually lead to a catastrophe, a disaster that weighs so much more than the benefit it created. When the RMBK's flaw known since 1975 were revealed to be hidden for political optics, the moral authority of Soviet science vanished. People realized that it is the very system that they believed in that killed them. Citizens realized that the Soviet tech bureaucracy, tech bureaucrats, these experts will sacrifice public safety just to maintain the illusion of socialist superiority. The tech bureaucrats is a very important class in the Soviets towards the end of the Soviet regime. And this class has lost the respect of the people forever. It also created an economic black hole that was so big that the country cannot recover. We'll first start with the cost of liquidation. It is estimated that the USSR spent roughly 18 billion rubles in the first few years following the incidents. Now, how do we understand this? This is the amount of money that is about 30% of the military spending of the USSR annually during that time. It is also about 2 to 3% of the GDP of the USSR around that time. In a time of stagflation and economic losses, this just completely ruined the economic back then. After this event, Gorbachev had to ask for economic help from the Western Bloc, from West Germany. And this came at a cost. It came at a cost of openness and taking down of Berlin Wall. The cost of liquidation was so big that Gorbachev had to give up very important bargain powers of the Soviet Union. The state mobilized over 600,000 liquidators, thousands of armed vehicles, helicopters, and specialized engineer equipment. After the first set of firefighters, the Soviet Union tried to negotiate with Western blocs in order to deploy robots from Japan, from West Germany. But however, as soon as the robot reached the scene, such high radiation and heat instantly destroyed the robot circuit. So they realized that they had to send human robots there to ensure the entire thing. People will spend 90 minutes up there and have to change another set of people because 90 seconds of radio exposure is the maximum amount of time of radio exposure a human can actually survive in his entire life. The lost energy capacity as well. The disaster forced the shutdown of all other 3 functional reactors at the site. Furthermore, RMPK construction projects across the USSR were halted or massively redesigned. RMBK 1000 constructors that have already been used has also been subject to large critics, and some of them also have to quit. In a time of economic deflation, the USSR have to reshape its energy use as well as changing its very heavy industrial base. It just created so much problem that the country cannot deal with. We can see that this event affected USSR much more than just the 18 billion rubles in the first few years after the incidents. It affected this country in so much more ways. For example, the people who died from it, as well as the entire economy, have to change shape for it. It also lead to losses of land. Over 150,000 square kilometer of land, which is roughly half the size of Italy, were severely contaminated. These land, until nowadays, is still no man land. People do not live there anymore because they're subject to high radiation. More than 30,000 people were forced to evacuate their home forever in Ukraine. In these cases, the Soviet Union have to provide job, renegotiate terms with these people, as well as providing them food. In conclusion, Chernobyl was an inevitable eruption of a decaying Soviet bureaucracy where political correctness override scientific truth. We can see in so many steps of the entire process, it is this political correctness that eventually lead to the problem. Whether from the 1975 Leningrad crisis, in which the Soviet bureaucrats tried to hide the problem that's already existing, it proved that a system built on information asymmetry and dictatorship will eventually lose all capacity for self-corrections. Ultimately, this disaster didn't just destroy a nuclear reactor, it shattered the state's legitimacy. It signals the inevitable fall of an empire built on lies. It goes beyond Ukraine because all members, all blocs of the eastern region has seen that the USSR has tried to hide this truth, hide something that has actually been ruining their country and ruining their health as well, and eventually lead to the downfall of USSR. That is all. Thank you so much.